Hello there, and welcome back to my channel. My name is John Hathaway, and today we're going to be starting a new series called Unmasking Religion. And this is a series dedicated to helping people who, like believers who are outgrowing or who have outgrown fundamentalist Christianity or fundamentalist religion, and who are looking for the next stage of development, the next stage of growth in their life, and kind of how to navigate during this uncertain time and things like that. So this episode is going to be about what to do when the church fails us. I'm sure that there's probably some of you listening, and I know there's definitely many people out there who have grown up in fundamentalist churches and certain just conservative Christian groups where maybe there was a moral failing or some kind of scandal or religious abuse or spiritual abuse, however you want to label it, and basically it wasn't handled properly, or there was people hurt through that. And I can say that I can resonate with you in certain aspects of that. I haven't necessarily been like directly abused from a fundamentalist church, but I have seen it happen, and I feel like I have suffered from some, at least spiritual or religious abuse, not like in a physical way or anything like that, but from more of like a mental and emotional way. So that's what this video is about, is what do we do? What do you do when you're in a church environment where you feel like you're not, the church has failed you? You've maybe tried to reconcile things with the pastor or with the church or with the staff and things like that, or maybe you have family members in the church that still who still see things the way that the church staff and that the majority of that church sees things, and they maybe don't they're not willing to try to embrace a different perspective, or they're just not willing to grow with you through the hard times that you're going through. Maybe they're not helping you deal with emotional issues, or like anxiety or mental health issues and things like that. And I've been there in some of those cases where I've been in churches and I've been dealing with anxiety and some probably some mental health problems and like mild depression and stuff like that. And I didn't feel like it was a safe space for me to go to an authority figure in the church for counseling or for help in any of that, in any of those areas. I prayed and I sought the Lord through scripture, and sometimes fasted, or would try many different routes to to try to overcome some of these problems in my life. But it wasn't until I realized that I wasn't going to get help inside the four walls of the church that things started to get better for me. So I think that this is an important topic to discuss. And I just want to say, well, first of all, it is a normal thing for churches to fail us, because churches are made up of people, and all of us, that there's nobody that's perfect, that's without flaw, who's never made a mistake. Churches are just by nature, they're going to fail at some point or another. Now, there's a difference between a church failing and a church that just basically covers up their failure, and who doesn't respond appropriately to the crisis at hand, or to the situation at hand. And I know that there's been several situations where people maybe confronted a pastor or an authority figure in the church about something immoral that happened, and then later they were accused of touching God's anointed, or of questioning God's anointed one, or basically standing up against the authority of the church. And it was basically made to look like the victims, or maybe not necessarily the victims, but those who were standing up for the victims, and even probably the victims themselves, that they were the ones who are at fault, and who a lot. And I've seen it many times where like there's some kind of, let's just say, a scandal in the church where a pastor does something inappropriate, like he's married and he does something inappropriate with another woman or with a young girl or something like that, and it's swept under the rug. Now, first of all, the victim in that situation is not the pastor, and often it is in church settings, it's made to look like, oh, the pastor, it's so sad that he's fallen into sin, and the devil got a hold of him, and so they actually victimize the abuser, when the abuser is the one who is causing someone else to be a victim. And they just basically they might sometimes give hush money to the victim to stay silent, or they'll shuffle people around from state to state, like they'll move a pastor from a church in one state to a church in another state, so that way the authorities in that state can't have jurisdiction over them, and things like that. And it's just crazy. I mean, if maybe you've never heard of those kind of stories before, but I'm going to assume that probably most of you have heard of some of those kinds of situations going on. And so I just want to dedicate this video to those of you who are either victims of these kinds of scandals and failures, or those of you who have seen this kind of scandal and failure like I have, and you haven't seen appropriate action taken place, and you see that there's injustice going on, and you see that there's an imbalance of power on behalf of the church leadership. So first of all, the thing I want to say is, if you were harmed by if you were directly abused by a pastor or by a spiritual authority figure in a church, I just want to say that you have my greatest condolences. I'm very sorry for that, and that should never have happened. And if that has happened, you shouldn't have to feel any shame about speaking up about that. And I'm not calling for people to, I know that we're in a movement where it's very popular to have this victim mindset of you're always a victim. And I'm not trying to encourage that, but I do want to encourage people, if you truly have been victimized by someone, it's okay to speak up about it. And also, if you see someone that's being victimized and you don't do something about it, well, then you're participating, you're guilty by association of taking the side of the abuser if you don't say something, and if you don't report it to the authorities, if there is some kind of scandal or some kind of criminal behavior going on. Now, let's just say that with that out of the way, I'm not going to be spending this whole episode talking about necessarily criminal situations and scandals and things like that, but I also want to spend a good portion of this episode just talking about more of the mental and the mental, emotional, and the spiritual abuse side of church failure. And I think that that's very common among a lot of people in in traditional Christian churches and fundamentalist Christian churches and things like that. Now, why is it that we feel like the church has failed us? Well, for one example, I felt like, and I said this in my last video when I was doing a preview for this new series, I talked about how I grew up in fundamentalist, or I spent a good portion of my life, from about 2009 till like 2020. I basically spent that whole time in fundamentalist Christianity, and I was expected to, I felt this enormous pressure to conform to a certain image of like a super Christian. Like, I felt like I was immoral if I listened to the kind of music that I like to listen to. Like, I like to listen to like a lot of 80s rock music, like the Eagles and AC/DC and different things like that. And I couldn't listen to that kind of stuff in front of other Christians I knew, for fear of being ostracized and called different kinds of things, and being told that I'm worldly and that I'm not sold out, I'm not a true Christian, and things like that. So I conformed to the image that the church wanted me to appear as, and I put on this facade of this super Christian facade, which is why I'm calling this series Unmasking Religion, because I'm trying to encourage you to remove that superficial mask of super Christian and just be who you really are. Be authentic. Be your authentic self. There's a lot of things, and like the music is a big one for me, because I grew up listening to, in my family growing up, we used to listen to a lot of like 70s, 80s rock, sometimes older stuff like the Beatles, and even some newer music like into the 90s and early 2000s that would be secular music that's not like approved as spiritual music or Christian music. Yet a lot of that music that I listened to didn't necessarily have anything like anti-Christian in it, but just because it was considered worldly by Christians today, we were told that we shouldn't listen to that kind of stuff, and that you're sinning and everything like that if you listen to worldly music. And so I felt guilty because of that. There was other reasons I felt guilty, some other secret sins I had, and there was like just the pressure to for example, there's a big thing in the independent fundamental Baptist movement is dress standards. Like, if you go to church, you're expected to wear a suit and a tie and a dress shirt if you're a guy. And if you're a girl, you're expected to either wear a dress or like a blouse and a long skirt, like a skirt that at least goes past the length of your knees, making sure that you're not exposing any of your thigh, or maybe not wearing a blouse that goes up too high on your arm, like, or like for girls, not making sure that your blouse neckline doesn't go too low or anything, for modesty reasons. Also, I think that's another episode I want to talk about, is modesty, because that is a word in the Bible that has been misinterpreted, like grossly misinterpreted by the church, when the actual meaning of the word modesty in Scripture, it's not talking about necessarily like showing skin or like causing people to lust, but when the Bible says the word modesty, what modest is basically means humble, or it's another word for like meek or humble, and like modesty could be like synonymous with humility. Basically, it means you're not trying to draw attention to yourself, like, and it's so funny because the independent Baptists are some of the people that preach the hardest on modesty, yet they're some of the most immodest people when it comes to dress standards, because they're wearing all these flashy ties and expensive suits, and like some of the ladies will wear these flashy necklaces and expensive jewelry and stuff like that. And that is the exact opposite of modesty. And like when you, it's funny, like they think that when they're going into, a lot of these fundamentalist Christians, they think that when they're going into a restaurant, like on Sunday afternoon after church for lunch, and they're in their dresses and suits and ties, they think, oh, we're being these great witnesses for the Lord and showing people the proper way to dress and how a Christian ought to dress, when actually it's just showing the world, look, here's these high-minded hypocrites that are trying to, they think that they're better than everyone else. They're wearing these fancy clothes, and they're and all this expensive jewelry, and they're being snooty, and they're not tipping people well for their meals. But that's something for another episode. That's a rabbit trail we're not going to go down right now. But it's crazy though. I think I'm going a little bit off topic, but sometimes I do that on this channel, and we'll be fine. So yeah, there's the issue of dress standards. You're expected to dress a certain way. You're expected to, if you go swimming as a guy, you're expected to, like publicly swimming, a lot of churches, they don't even want you to go publicly swimming unless it's only with other men, and that's a little bit weird if you ask me. But I mean, but then, like, for those maybe lighter or less legalistic ones, they'll like say, you ought to wear a shirt. Guys ought to wear a shirt when they're swimming, and women need to wear these culottes, which is like basically which are basically shorts that look like a skirt, and you're supposed to wear these like long, thick, flowing garments, blouses and stuff like that while you're swimming, so that it doesn't attract any attention to your body or anything like that. And a lot of that stuff is just not even in the Bible. It's not even talked about in the Bible. I think that was like probably the furthest thing from Paul's mind when he was writing about for people to dress modestly and to not be attracting attention to themselves. I think he would probably more be addressing the people who are trying to dress all fancy and make a show of how expensive their clothes are, and what expensive brands of clothing they're wearing and jewelry and all that. And so when you put pressure, the point of all that I'm saying is that when you put all that pressure on someone to live up to these standards, and you're supposed to dress a certain way, you're supposed to have the right version of the Bible. If you're an independent Baptist, it's the King James Version. And if you read any other version of the Bible, you're either a lost sinner on their way to hell, or you're just a deceived Christian, and you're backslidden, and you're not right with God, and God's not going to bless you as much as he blesses those who read the King James Version. And which is crazy to me, because the King James Version came out 1600 years after the time of Christ, and yet we treat it like it was written, like the King James Version was penned by God himself. And that's probably gonna tick some of you off, and frankly I don't really care. But anyway, if that ticks you off, I'm just gonna say this series is probably not for you to watch. If you're happy and you're doing well in your church environment that you're currently at, and you don't see any problems with the church, just go find another YouTube channel that will help you. And then whenever a crisis happens in your life, or whenever the church does wind up failing you and you see the hypocrisy, then you can come back to this channel and maybe help you grow to the next stage in your spiritual development. So what do you do whenever you have all this pressure? Well, I'll just kind of explain to you what I did in my life whenever all this stuff started to accumulate, and I started to experience spiritual burnout. I felt like I was burning the candle on both ends when it came to my religiosity and spirituality. I was going to church services 3 days a week. I was serving in a junior church ministry every Sunday, and with very little help. It was basically just me and my wife in there, and occasionally we had someone else helping us. And with like a lot of these inner city youth that were in there and causing a ruckus, and it was, very hard to to keep a grasp on, to keep them under control. But yeah, basically in 2020 I was experiencing spiritual burnout, and I wound up, well, first of all, that 2020, of course, that was when the coronavirus pandemic happened. And during that time, the church I was going to wound up shutting its doors, and it went to online services only for maybe like 2 or 3 weeks at the beginning of the pandemic, and when the lockdown started happening and everything. So when that happened, first of all, I felt like there must be something wrong with me, because during that time that we were doing church from home and I wasn't having to worry about controlling all those inner city youth in the junior church and things like that, I felt like the most relaxed, and I just felt like so much better than I have every time that we were in church. And I frankly, to be honest, I didn't want to go back to church. I didn't want to go back to our church. I'll just put it that way. The church I was going to at the time. And I was talking to my wife at the time, like, have you ever thought about maybe trying out some different churches, maybe even some different denominations? And I thought that was a crazy thought at the time. Or I probably would have thought that was a crazy thought a year or two before, because I was fully bought in as this super Christian that had everything figured out and was doing all the right things. But I started to see a lot of this hypocrisy going on. So I asked my wife that, and I think at first she was a little bit skeptical about what I was about the things I was seeing. And then church started to open back up. We started going back and being involved in the different ministries and stuff like that. They didn't fully open up junior church back up right away during 2020, but I noticed a lot of this hypocrisy, and I pointed it out to my wife. And long story short, at the end of the year, I had won her over to my side, and she saw the hypocrisy and the basically just the negative attitude and the not the piousness, not my name, but like the false humility and just the prideful arrogance of the authority in this church. And I'm not going to call out any names or anything like that, and it wasn't just that one church, it was basically most of that movement that I was seeing issues with. And a lot of my friends who were in different independent Baptist churches, that from like 3 different churches, that not including the one I was going to, I knew friends from 3 different churches that like I went to college with, or I knew from Bible college, and they were all experiencing the same things that I was at that time, that me and my wife were, and just feeling like the church was failing us, and like that we weren't growing spiritually, and that basically we were just, it just felt like so discouraging to go to church every Sunday because of the religious and spiritual abuse and the narcissism and everything that was going on in there. So what happened was, well, first of all, we visited a couple different times, like when we were on vacation, my wife and I, and sometimes one of my friends, we would go visit some of these different churches in the area just to kind of check them out and see what other churches are like in different denominations. And we were very pleasantly surprised that these churches that we were always told were like worldly and sinful and or not, and like progressive and everything like that, we were pleasantly surprised that they were actually like preaching true, like what we considered to be true doctrine, Bible doctrines and things like that. And they believed basically the same as we did, but they were more loving and more kind and less legalistic in a lot of ways. At least it seemed like it. And so after a while, basically towards the end of 2020, I wrote a letter to my pastor, and the letter said basically that we were going to be looking for another church. We didn't wish any, we didn't have any animosity towards him or towards that church, but we just felt like we were not growing there spiritually, and we felt like we had some disagreements with how that denomination operated, and that we were going to try to find a church in a different denomination. And he sent me a text back after receiving that letter, and he said, you know, like, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that you're leaving. We love you guys, and you know, we wish you the best, and we're and I see a lot of the same problems that you see in this denomination and stuff like that. And so I thought, okay, well, you know, maybe he is understanding. And I told him in that letter that we would basically plan to visit the church or go to stay at our church for like a couple more weeks to like say our goodbyes to everyone and stuff like that before we left. But what happened after that is the pastor and his family got COVID, and he did a live stream on Facebook for a Wednesday night service. They live streamed that sermon, and I think he did it from his house or something like that. But because they decided to close the church for that Wednesday night, not have regular services because him and his family had COVID, and there wasn't a whole lot of people, like there wasn't a ton of other people that were going to the church at that time. So, and it was just a Wednesday night. So, so they had a Facebook Live message, and basically the whole message was this sob story about how these young people, these young Christians, are abandoning us. They're leaving us in this hard time. We're going through a crisis right now, this pandemic, and they're just leaving us in the dust and going to pursue their wildest dreams and everything like that. And he didn't name me and my wife by name, but we definitely knew who he was referring to when he was preaching that. And he was pulling all these verses out about like people leaving the faith, and like people and this like great falling away, and which is talking about like the end times. And he was basically like comparing this situation to being in the end times when Christian, or when like so-called believers are going to be falling away from the true faith and stuff like that. And so yeah, we saw that as a interruption of our 2 weeks notice, and so we just decided we were going to start going to another church at that point. So we started visiting a bunch of different churches. My wife and I took a break from ministry. We probably took about 5 or 6 months of visiting several different churches, like over a dozen different churches, and we landed at one that we really enjoy. We're still there to this day. And basically I told my wife like that we should probably take at least a year at that church before we like volunteer for any kind of ministry or anything like that, just to kind of so we can kind of rest spiritually, because we were at that stage where we felt spiritually burnt out, and we were kind of discouraged from our last church experience. And so things have been going good since then. Now, I've a lot of things that I've like done since then, like research wise and stuff, have been from like different podcast and YouTube channels that I follow and things like that. And um, and I would just encourage you, if you're not sure about something in your church, like you've probably been told, you might be told, if you're in a very controlling narcissistic spiritual environment, that they might tell you like you shouldn't listen to anybody but your pastor, or make sure that if you get any advice outside of the church, make sure it's from someone that agrees with us on the doctrine, on the fundamentals of the faith, or make sure that there's someone who uses the same correct version of the Bible that we do. And it's just very, very narcissistic when you think about it, and just manipulative, and it's crazy. But I would just say, if you're in that kind of environment, and if you feel like something's wrong, well, your conscience and your intuition is probably correct about that. You've probably heard it said before, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And I would say that the reverse is also true, that if something sounds terrible and you're being told that it's a good thing, well, your conscience is probably correct that it's actually terrible, or like that it's not as good as people are saying it is, if your conscience is telling you that something's not right. Usually our conscience and our intuition is correct. If your body is sending you these signals about something and giving you red flags about a situation, you need to listen. You need to pay attention to those red flags. I'm not saying that you have to respond. You have to have these knee-jerk reaction responses every time your body has some kind of emotional response, that you have to act on that always. But you should be mindful of those. Be mindful of your intuition and of your gut reaction. Pay attention to those things, because a lot of times that's valuable information that our body and our mind are trying to relay to us, that we need to pay attention to. And it's just amazing, the God-given faculties that we have in our mind, in our psyche, and everything like that. So those things shouldn't be ignored. And you should research you should research whatever topics that you feel like if you feel like you're being spoon-fed some kind of doctrine or some kind of belief, and you haven't verified it to be true, and you feel like something is missing, or something just seems a little bit off, well, go on a deep dive on that subject. And I've done that with many different things, and I've been surprised by what the outcome was on a lot of those things. A lot of times when I was looking for something and I was looking for a specific answer, well, a lot of times the answer was way, way different than what I was expecting to find. And you need to be open to whatever the truth is. Truth never fears a challenge. So seek the truth. Don't be afraid of change. I would just say that. Don't be afraid of change. That's probably one of the biggest hindrances to spiritual growth and to going into the next stage of our spiritual development, is because we're afraid of change. We want things to remain the same, and we want things to be comfortable. I mean, it's just part of our psyche, a part of our ego, our bodies and our minds. We get comfortable, and we get used to patterns and routines, and even sometimes routines that are bad for us, we get comfortable in them, and we learn to stick with those things even though they're not good for us. So I would just encourage you to do all the research that you need to do, and don't be afraid of change. Seek the truth. Whatever you do, seek for pray and do whatever you need to do. Research the scriptures. A lot of times you'll find out that what the scriptures tell you is not what the popular interpretation of it is. there's been a lot of scriptures that have been twisted and manipulated and taken out of context by Christians over the past 2,000 years. And a lot of times that they have absolutely nothing to do with what the scripture is actually saying. So I think we're just going to end it right there. I'm sorry if I ran some of you guys off, but for those of you who stuck with me through this video, and if you plan to continue sticking through to see where this series goes and where this channel goes, I really appreciate you. I love all of you, and thank you for watching. Hope you all have a good day. God bless.